Okay, this video is going to be about linear equations, specifically just slope-intercept form, standard form, point-slope form, and then we're going to get some problems here in a second, how to graph and how to pull the equation from the graph and so on, but we'll do the example problems next. This is just going to be the lecture notes, so if you missed it in class, you can go and refer to this. So the first thing we talk about is slope-intercept form. Slope-intercept form is y equals mx plus b. Okay. Hopefully you've all heard that equation before. That's kind of like the big equation that you're going to come across in algebra. And hopefully it'll make sense when we get done with this video what it all means. Now, I'm going to throw a lot of vocabulary at you, and yes, you are responsible for knowing this. These are all different meanings of the word or the variable y in this equation that you could come across if you're taking a Keystone test or an SAT or an ACT or whatever. These are things you just need to know. Your y is what they call your output. It's also your range. It can also be the y-coordinate. So if you're dealing with a set of ordered pairs, remember in ordered pairs, the x comes before the y. That's what I'm talking about as far as the y-coordinate. It's also your dependent variable. The y, the x determines what the y is going to be. The x when you put it in and solve the equation. The y has no control over it. That's why they say it's the dependent variable. It depends on what happens in the problem. It'll all make sense when we get to the word problems. And it's also going to be list 2. Eventually you're going to be able to use your calculator, and I'll show you a few tricks that'll help you get these, and you always put the y-coordinate in list 2. Okay. The letter M stands for slope. I know it's really intuitive because the letter M shows up so many times in the word slope that they pick the word slope, so I don't know why they use the letter M. But anyway, the letter M is slope. It's also the word per. So in a word problem, if you see the word per, they're talking about slope. If you're going miles per hour, you know that your miles is the y and your x, or your hours would be your x. So that's why I tell students all the time when people say they don't use algebra. If you ever drive a car, if you're ever using a rate, whether you're going, how much money you make per hour, if you make $10 an hour, $10 per hour, or you go 30 miles per hour, you're using algebra to predict how far you're going or how much money you're going to make. You may not think of it that way, but you are. It's also your rate. Is another word that will be used. There's a whole section in Study Island called Rate of Change that dedicates itself to nothing but the study of slope and how to calculate it, how to find it in word problems. Most students are familiar with it as rise over run when you're graphing. I'm not a huge fan of that. When I was a kid, my teacher taught us the delta y over delta x. The Greek letter delta is that little triangle, and in math and science it stands for the change of. So it's read the change in y over the change in x. And to figure out how something changes, you subtract the values. So this delta y over delta x will yield the equation y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. That's the equation to calculate slope. You're going to see that in a little while. Then we move on and we have the letter x. So think of everything the y is, the x is the opposite of. So let me scroll down just a little bit so you can see what I'm talking about. If y is your output, x is the input. If y is the range, x is the domain. If y is the y-coordinate, x is the x-coordinate. If y is the dependent variable, then x is the independent variable. And if y goes in list 2, then x goes in list 1. So if you can remember this, hopefully you can derive what that one is. And then finally, the letter B stands for the y-intercept. This is the only explanation, the only definition I accept for that. It is not the y-axis, so don't write the y-axis down. It's the y-intercept, and that means it's the point where the line crosses the y-axis. You can think of it as a starting point. That's why I have this in quotation, but it's not a starting point. You can't think of it that way. It's where the line touches the y-axis. That's what the y-intercept is. Okay? Now, brings us to the next thing, standard form. Standard form is ax plus by equals c, where a is always positive and never a fraction. This makes no mention of slope. So if they give you something in standard form and they ask you what the slope is, you can't tell by looking at it unless you convert it back into slope-intercept form. So keep that in mind. You're going to see questions like that in a little while. And then finally you have point slope form, which I feel is like not necessarily the most important equation in the world, but they do want you to know it. That's y minus y1 equals m times x minus x1. This one kind of comes in handy when you have a point and a slope, but to me, I would rather just use y equals mx plus b. I will show you this because you do need to know it, but it's not something I focus on, because if you can do standard form and slope-intercept form, this is kind of like the lame one that you can kind of just figure out as you go through. But you still need to know it, so we'll talk about it in a second. So those are the lecture notes for linear equations.